Hey Rams, welcome to Rams History. Today we're going to be talking about the late Middle Ages, in particular the disastrous 14th century. Now most of us are familiar with the four horsemen of the apocalypse: pestilence, famine, war, and death. And certainly pestilence, famine, war, and death were very common in the lives of 14th century Europeans. In fact, there were a series of events that were happening nearly at the same time that caused Europeans to really believe their civilization was being rocked to its very foundations. These events were the Black Plague, the 100 Years' War, and a church controversy known as the Avignon Papacy. During the 14th century, in fact, many Europeans believed that civilization was simply coming apart. Now let's begin with the Black Plague. The plague was spread by a bacteria known as Yersinia pestis. Now, this bacteria lived in fleas that inhabited rats. Now these rats would be infected with the plague. The fleas would then move from the rat to an animal or to a human. And when they bit that person or animal, they would then deliver the plague bacteria into the bloodstream of that person. Once the plague bacteria was introduced, the symptoms would spread very rapidly. The earliest symptoms were a swelling of the lymph nodes known as a bubo, hence the name bubonic plague. Following the appearance of the bubo, the other symptoms would rapidly follow: chills, fever, diarrhea, vomiting, and eventually death. The plague could spread in other ways too. It could travel to the lungs and then be spread through droplets caused by sneezing or coughing. This was known as pneumonic plague, and it was just as deadly as its bubonic cousin. The plague was terrifying because it killed so rapidly and seemingly without reason. Now, the plague actually entered Europe through the ports of Italy. It's believed to have come from the area around the Black Sea, and once it arrived in Italy, it very quickly spread across Europe. You'll notice there were some areas of Europe which managed to avoid major outbreaks. These were areas that either took precautions with quarantines or were areas that were very remote and saw very few outsiders, and thus the plague had very little chance to enter. Now, it's really hard to overestimate the impact the Black Plague had on people living at the time. This illustration is from Belgium, and it shows a very common problem: what to do with the dead. In many towns and villages, people were dying faster than they could be buried. Now, of course, medieval Europeans put great store in a proper Christian burial, but in many cases, people really had no choice other than to dig a large pit and throw the bodies in as quickly as possible. This must have been distressing for the families of the deceased, but they really had no other choice. Now, the plague did infect different people in different ways. Some people became withdrawn, refusing to interact with others. Other people, believing that death was near at hand, gave themselves over to earthly pleasures like drinking and sex. Other groups became known as flagellants, and they traveled around Europe whipping themselves, hoping that the pain they were inflicting would cause God to relieve them of their sins. It's believed today, though, that the flagellants may have actually helped to spread the plague as they traveled from town to town with their open, bleeding wounds. Now, one group, unfortunately, was singled out for persecution during the plague, and that was the Jews. In many communities, Jews were very successful as business people and moneylenders. The early Christian church forbid Christians from lending money. It was called usury, and it was considered to be a sin. So in many communities, if you had to borrow money, you had to go to the Jews. Now, as a result, in many communities, people owed money to the Jews, and when the plague arrived, everyone was looking for a scapegoat. It was commonly believed, for example, that Jews were poisoning the water supply, which caused the disease to spread. So unfortunately, the arrival of the plague often coincided with the persecution of Jewish residents. In some communities, they were rounded up and expelled. In others, their property was confiscated. And it was not uncommon for Jews to be murdered during the plague, as people were quick to look for a cause they couldn't understand. So what's the result of all this? Well, the plague had many negative consequences. Of course, it killed large numbers of people, but it also had some positive outcomes too. For example, wages for farm laborers increased. As the number of workers went down, those surviving could demand higher wages. The feudal system began to draw to a close because when the plague had passed, Nobles tried to reassert their traditional rights, but were often successfully resisted. For example, attempts to limit wages often failed in the aftermath of the plague. Cities across Europe became more powerful. Again, the number of artisans dropped dramatically during the plague, so the surviving artisans were that much more powerful and prestigious. And of course, the cities in which they lived got some of that power and prestige as well. Perhaps the most important outcome of the plague was the decimation of the clergy. Many of the church's best and brightest died while tending to their flocks during the plague. The replacements who followed them were not nearly as competent. And the end result of this is that the church personnel were badly weakened at a time when the church was facing increasing criticism across Europe. So this decimation of the clergy could really not have come at a worse time for the Catholic Church. Moving on to our next catastrophe, the 100 Years' War. Now, this conflict began as a conflict over who would become the next king of France. Would it be Philip or Edward? English kings had been involved in French politics going all the way back to William the Conqueror in 1066. But as this war progressed, it really became a conflict between two up-and-coming European powers, England and France. Now, unfortunately for the French, the war did not go well for them at the beginning. The English were quite successful, winning a string of victories, and there's a number of reasons for this, which we'll discuss. One of the big reasons the English were so successful had to do with the weapons they used. English archers carried a weapon known as a longbow. It could be fired rapidly and accurately at great distances. The longbow was also quite powerful, and its arrow was capable of penetrating a knight's armor. The French were generally using crossbows, which were much slower to load and did not have the same range. The 100 Years' War also saw the introduction of gunpowder weapons, such as cannon and muskets. Now, this really helped to bring the age of the mounted knight to an end. Knights were already facing pressure from longbows, but they certainly could not repel cannon shot or musket fire. The Black Plague had begun the demise of the feudal ages, and the 100 Years' War helped to move that process along. Now, by 1429, the English were controlling more than half of France, and things were looking pretty bleak for the French. Again, as we mentioned, England had some advantages. The English leadership was much more politically shrewd and better militarily. England was more politically unified than France, which was much more disorganized. And we've already discussed the advantages that the British had on the battlefield with weapons like the longbow. Perhaps one of the biggest problems the French faced were kings. The French kings were very weak and indecisive. Just how weak were these kings? Well, basically they had to be bailed out by a teenage girl. Now, everyone's heard of Joan of Arc. She's perhaps the most famous name to come out of the 100 Years' War. She's pretty well known today. In fact, Hollywood has done a couple of feature films about her. She was played by Leelee Sobieski and Milla Jovovich in several recent films. And in fact, on Halloween, you can be Joan of Arc as you go from house to house liberating candy from your neighbors. Now, this isn't too bad for a 19-year-old girl who died nearly 600 years ago. So what's the deal with Joan? Well, she was a simple French peasant girl when she claimed she began hearing the voice of God, and God told her it was her destiny to liberate France from the English. She went to the French king, who I'm sure by this point was looking for any help he could get, and convinced him to give her an army. He did so, and she promptly liberated the city of Orleans from the English. Joan then began leading her troops to victory after victory, reconquering more of France as she went. Now, unfortunately for Joan, she was taken prisoner by the English, and of course the English were very desiring of basically making her look bad. They wanted to discredit her. So she was accused of being a heretic. Now remember, Joan claimed to hear the voice of God. She was also very fond of wearing men's clothing. Let's face it, skirts get in the way on the battlefield. So Joan was convicted of being a heretic, and she was burned at the stake at the tender age of 19. However, in a sense, Joan achieved her goal. Although the war continued after her death, the war ended quite well for France. By 1453, France had reconquered all of its lost territory, and in fact had begun to resemble its modern-day appearance as far as borders go. So the war began poorly for the French, but it actually ended quite well. What are the consequences? Well, as we mentioned, the feudal system continued its demise as the age of mounted knights came to an end. Large areas of France were badly devastated and would remain so for years. Gunpowder weapons became the norm on the battlefield going forward and would spread to other conflicts across Europe. And perhaps most importantly, the war fostered a growing sense of English and French nationalism. People in those countries began to see themselves not as the subjects of a particular lord, but rather as citizens of an English or French nation. That's a very important concept going forward, because as more and more people began to consider themselves residents of a nation, it's going to change the political map of Europe. Now, our final disaster here is the Avignon Papacy. This was a conflict that impacted the Church, which was really the bedrock of European civilization. Began as a conflict between the King of France and the Pope in Italy. They were fighting over how much influence the Pope actually had over French political matters. Now, it's hard to believe today, but the Pope was actually kidnapped on the orders of the French king. He was beaten. Now, the experience was so traumatic for him, the Pope actually died. Now, the problem begins when a new Pope is elected. That Pope is French. And he doesn't find the climate in Italy very friendly. So he decides to leave Rome, and he heads to a city called Avignon near the border of France. He believes it will be much safer there. Now, Avignon was a nice place, as such things go. The popes built themselves a nice palace, as you can see, and they quickly developed a reputation for high living. Now, that reputation, unfortunately, would damage the popes in the eyes of many Europeans. Now, they say, ladies and gentlemen, that perception is reality, and Avignon is a really good example of that. People began to believe that the Pope had become nothing more than the puppet of a French king. And really, in some ways, people were not wrong in believing that. Look at the numbers here. During the time of the Avignon Papacy, 7 out of 7 popes were French, as well as 113 out of 134 cardinals. During the nearly 70 years that the popes remained in Avignon, people began to refer to it as the Babylonian captivity. This referred to a period of time in the Old Testament when the Jews were held captive in Babylon. Now, this did tremendous damage to the reputation of the papacy and began to cause many Europeans to question their loyalty to the Church. Now, eventually the Pope did return to Rome, but in a sense this just made things worse. The Pope who returned to Rome died shortly after returning there, and a new Italian Pope was elected to replace him. The problem is that most of the cardinals were still French, and they later claimed that they only chose an Italian Pope out of fear. The French cardinals then elected a French Pope of their own, and the result is we now have 2 popes, one in Avignon and one in Rome. Which to follow? Well, take your pick. Now, this condition continued for a number of years. This became known as the Western Schism. A schism is a fracture or a break. We actually had a fracture in the Christian Church. Some people following the Pope in Rome, others following the Pope in Avignon. To make matters worse, they attempted to solve this by electing another Pope, and actually for a short period of time, there were 3 popes running around Europe, each claiming to be the legitimate Pope. Now, eventually this was all sorted out at a meeting called the Council of Constance, which elected a new Pope that everyone agreed on, and at that point the other popes stepped down and the Church began to move forward. But by that point the damage was done. The authority of the Church had been badly weakened across Europe. For example, in France, they spoke of Gallican liberties. Now, what this meant was that the Pope might control religious affairs in France, but he had no control over political matters. Now, as I mentioned, the Avignon popes developed a reputation for high living. Now, this required money. For example, the Church began practices like the sale of indulgences to raise money. Now, this gave ammunition to Church critics like Martin Luther, who much later would begin the Reformation. Finally, and perhaps most seriously, This caused a great gap between spiritual Christians and the Catholic Church. Many Christians began to believe that the church was more concerned with influencing politics and accumulating wealth than it was with trying to save Christian souls. And that was a very serious problem for the church going forward. So to kind of summarize here, the 14th century was one of constant disaster and turmoil, with the Black Plague, the 100 Years' War, and the Avignon Papacy all taking a toll on European civilization. Thank you for listening to Ram's History, and we'll see you again soon.